Good morning, Dave. Hello, my friend.
Hey, Sasha, good to be with you, mate.
Heartfelt thanks for taking the time for this interview. It's wonderful that we can also spread good practical teaching about economics from a biblical perspective here in Germany. It's a great joy to have you here and to be able to hear from these great things. Thank you, Dave. Dave, you are a world leader in many different fields and sectors of economy. Ideas about societal success, and perhaps most importantly, Christian teaching and ministry. In Germany, there's not nearly as much impact of your teachings as in most parts of the world, which we are working on right now to change. Starting with nothing at all you have been able to create the Paladin Corporation, now consisting of 35 companies worldwide, and to accumulate assets worth 7 billion US dollars. But most of all, you are known all over the world for your teachings, which aim to change major aspects of the economy and trade, as well as society itself, and by doing so, to eliminate poverty and stress on a national or even global level. This sounds wonderful. Let us start by describing how to implement your teachings in a general way, and then move on to some more specific aspects of your teachings, particularly concerning Germany, where we are aiming to distribute these elements of the good message to improve the economy and so many other aspects of society, which is
Yeah.
probably more necessary right now than ever. Okay, Dave, here comes the first question. How can we achieve the goals of eliminating poverty and stress in a significant way?
Well, it's a funny thing because we here in Australia, we don't think of much of poverty in Germany. We think Germany is a big economy in Europe and so on. But the answer to the question, whichever country it's in, is we know from our own research and our own studies over many, many years. KI has been running for 22 years really now, since it first started. And we know that if we're going to deal with, or let's say if we're going to eliminate, which is the word used, poverty and human misery and human distress and human suffering, we have to deal with the actual root cause. Okay, so as Christians, we tend to deal with the symptoms quite a lot. And we see poverty, or we find orphans, so we want to build an orphanage, and that's a really good thing, but it doesn't stop orphans. It doesn't eliminate orphans. It only helps those existing ones, but there's millions more coming. So we have to deal with the root cause. And we've learnt a long time ago that the biggest root cause of all of these things, especially poverty, is actually greed and self-centeredness. So we think of, poverty, maybe it comes from, unemployment, or somebody's parents got killed and the children are orphans and they're very poor kids and stuff, or they're living in a country which is a poor country. Well, it's only poor because of greed and self-centeredness. And if we can fix the greed and the self-centeredness, then we can deal with the poverty. The poverty fixes itself. And that way we're not forever building orphanages or trying to, build houses for the homeless and so on. So I can give you an example if you want on something like that.
Please go ahead. Please.
Yeah. So a few years ago, it was actually during COVID, or just when COVID had just started, the biggest social distress issue in our region, it wasn't poverty, it was domestic violence. Okay, so in my region, which is the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, Australia, the biggest issue that we had, social issue, was domestic violence. And so I got onto my research team here in the office. I have a research team. And I said to them, I want you to find out what is the biggest root cause of DV, domestic violence, so that we can deal with it. And we as Christians, we must deal with it under the sheep and goat nations narrative, which we can get to later. But the sheep nations people, the people group who form sheep nations, they must help, okay? They don't have an option. So I wanted to know what's the root cause. So I got my team to look into it. And they came back after about 6 weeks of research, and they said the biggest cause in Australia of domestic violence is financial hardship. So I said, okay, what's the biggest root cause of financial hardship? Okay, so they went looking again and they came back and they said unemployment. Okay, so what's the biggest root cause of unemployment? You see, we're tracking the root cause of domestic violence, but we want to get to what's causing it.
Awesome.
And then we found that the biggest root cause of unemployment is profit-driven businesses. Businesses driven only by profit to the extent that they won't employ people unless they really, really need them. Okay, so therefore, if we're going to change this problem, we have to change the culture that was driving the businesses. And then once we did that, we had to look at it and say, okay, if we can convince the business people to employ unemployed people, even if they don't need them, then we will fix domestic violence. But we'll also fix a whole lot of other social issues like suicide and drug abuse and everything else along the way. So we had to go to that root cause. And it's kind of crazy. You think, well, who's going to employ somebody when they don't need them? But when you quantify it and you say to them, okay, guys, if you employ all of these unemployed people, if we all do it, then there's no unemployment. Crime drops, this drops, that drops. Suddenly, all of these unemployed people have got a whole lot of money to spend in your community. And we quantified what benefit it would be for the business people if they employed people they didn't need. And the result was they would make 48% more than if they didn't employ them. So it was amazing.
Great, awesome. What could you just recommend honest, regular citizens in Germany having a job? What could they contribute to this kind of teaching? How could they in their just normal life respond to this problem of greedy misbehavior which ruins society so massively?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different answers to that, Sasha. So if they, as an employee, there's various ways of doing it, but as an employer, there's a lot more scope to do it if you're an employer.
Yes, we will come to that later. I know that. Thank you.
Yeah. So
I just wanted to break it down for a general use, because I do not think most listeners will be having a company. We will come to that, which is the main area of which we are talking about with the most impact. But maybe we can find some hints for everyone who is watching.
Yeah. Well, the biggest thing is to try to convince people that the alternative is better for them than carrying on with what we're doing. So, you called it greedy misbehavior and so on, but if we are, since we were children, we've been taught that we must maximize our self-interest on all of these things. And we tend to hoard all the wealth as much as we can. We go to work to try to create wealth and so on and so on. And most of the time we're doing it at the expense of someone else. So even if you're competing for jobs and you're competing for business or you're competing for promotion, usually it's at the expense of someone else. So if we can change that culture, and we call it a culture, instead of greed and self-centeredness, we call it a culture of caring and sharing. It's counterintuitive in the marketplace. Nobody wants to do that. So you have to show them the benefit of doing that. You've got to prove the concept. So it doesn't matter if you're the lowest, newest employee and you're only 16 years old and you're getting a job at McDonald's. I guess you guys have got McDonald's in Germany.
Yes, we do.
And there, even at that level, all the way to the guys that are CEO of McDonald's in the United States, if we all change our culture and we understand the benefits and then we can prove it, you have to actually prove it. And that was why I started talking about how we worked out this unemployment initiative so that we could get businesses to employ people. We had to prove to them factually that they will make more money if they actually employ people they don't need. And that was such a strange concept to them. They're thinking, you've got to be kidding, we're driven by profit and we need to make sure that we get our pound of flesh from all of the stakeholders in our business. But they didn't realize that when they have one stakeholder, which happens to be the community, and if everybody in the community is struggling because of unemployment, well, who's going to buy your product? If you make them rich, they'll buy your product. Okay, so you have to prove the concept. To answer your question, everybody up and down that rank has to learn from KI, learn from all the testimonies from other people. How do we convince other people to do it this way instead of the way we've always done it?
Thank you. Great. Just one other question. Let me take you back a little to the foundations of your own experiences and the sources of your thinking. How did you personally come to realize that the economic system needs fundamental change? And how did you discover what you see as the root causes of widespread problems we face today?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I grew up in Africa, and I grew up in a country called Rhodesia. It's now called Zimbabwe. When it was Rhodesia, I grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s. I'm 70 years old, so I was at school in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in Rhodesia, it was a British colony, and the British colony declared independence from England illegally. Okay. But the point is that then it became an independent country for 15 years as Rhodesia. Now, it became the breadbasket of Africa. The economy was so strong, and the farming was so good, the minerals, the mining, everything was so good. It was the most racially liberal country in southern Africa. In other words, there was no apartheid, so the social issues were minimal. We could intermarry black and white. My first language wasn't even English. My first language was Bemba, from a country to the north. But the point I'm making is that Rhodesia was the breadbasket of Africa. Corruption was very, very low, and it was very prosperous, and all of us prospered in the country. But there was a war of independence, so black nationalism was sweeping down through Africa, and when they lost the war, but they won politically because of sanctions and so on. But either way, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980. Okay, so President Robert Mugabe took over with a socialist government, which was really a neo-communist government, but nevertheless, it was so corrupt that within 2 years, Zimbabwe began importing maize for the first time in nearly 100 years. Okay, and then of course he plundered the economy so badly the place just turned into not the breadbasket of Africa, but the basket case of Africa. So from very affluent, wealthy country to a very poor country where the people were starving in just a few years, hyperinflation, all the normal things because of corruption and greed and self-centeredness. And Mugabe became one of the richest men in the world, okay, while his people starved. So I left Africa and I came to Australia, and I thought, wow, we're in heaven here. Look at this economy and how awesome and nice and stable, and nobody's, you know, corrupt and so on. Well, very quickly, I realized that was wrong. Australia was just as corrupt as Zimbabwe, except it was more sophisticated and more covert. You know, you couldn't see it until you got lifted up the curtain and had a look underneath, and it was very corrupt, and we started getting ripped off and things stolen from us very quickly, all sorts of government corruption, everything. And so I looked at this and I thought, wow, what is this that people have to be so corrupt? Why does this happen? And then I became a Christian when I was here, and I listened to the pastors preaching in church, and I thought, wow, okay, that sounds different. And I spoke to my new friends, and I said to my new Christian friends, hey guys, I'm a business person. I have a motorcycle in business, selling motorcycles, Italian bikes, Ducati and so on, Moto Guzzi. And I said, how do we apply those principles on Monday morning? And they said, nah, you can't apply that. That's the Bible. That's just moral things from an old agricultural society. And I thought, no, there has to be a solution. So I went back and I studied the history of human history, going all the way back to the beginnings of the Bible and, you know, the creation model, what happened. And then I tried to apply that with all the history surrounding the Bible. And I realized that as I came up all through those thousands of years of different types of economics and different types of societies. For example, the clans, when they first started getting together in England and Europe and all over those places, those developed into, you know, into city states and into feudal societies, and ultimately the big empires came. And then, you know, we had the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, all sorts of things. I watched all of these different frameworks and came into all the modern isms, communism, socialism, Zionism. And I found that none of them ever worked. Capitalism, nothing worked. It always led to poverty and human suffering and social distress and human misery and so on. And there was only one common denominator when I went looking, and it was the greed and self-centeredness that I've been talking about. And I realized that if we changed that model And if instead of having just greed and self-centeredness driven purely by profit, what if we looked after all of the stakeholders in our companies or in our businesses, just like the Bible was teaching us in the book of Ruth with Boaz and so on? If we changed it, just changed the culture that drove us. So we changed it from greed and self-centeredness to caring and sharing. So not socialism, just making sure that all of our stakeholders prosper in the company. And I tried that with my business. Once I understood it, I tried it and it worked. And we went from a small $100,000 a year company to a $2 million company in 2 financial years. It just boomed. And it was just amazing. So we called it holistic capitalism, or capitalism as it's known now. And we began teaching that once I started KI and so on, we began teaching that around the world. Now it's being taught in universities, holistic capitalism, which is effectively biblical economics. So that's how we worked it out.
Awesome. To help us, thank you, Dave, to help us get a clearer and more concrete picture, because that is a point which seems difficult to many people. They kind of grasp the theory, but then they ask, what shall I do in my concrete life, in my surroundings? Would you mind sharing some more examples? For instance, the story of how you bought that financially struggling fitness studio. I think it was in your early years of doing this.
Oh, yeah.
That could help our viewers understand the principles you apply, just to get it more like how to operate this, both in their practical implementation and how they actually work in real life. Can you walk us through the key decisions in that deal and why it exemplifies the new and better way of doing business, please?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go to that example that you're talking about. You've got a good memory, Sasha. These are old testimonies. But we owned a large health club. It was a women's health club in Canberra, which is our capital city, 2,000 kilometers from here. So we owned that. And my wife, she was the managing director, and she used to travel down there maybe once a month for a week or so and keep it all nice and then come back again. And we had management there. Now, there was another club nearby, which was a different franchise, okay? So ours was a franchise, but a big 5-star health club. Very, very fancy. Even had chandeliers in the toilets, in the bathrooms, which is kind of crazy. Awesome. But there was another health club nearby, and we knew it was struggling. It was a small health club, and it wasn't doing very well. And my wife said to me, I've heard that this health club is not doing so well. What do you think we should do? And I said, why don't you go and see if they are doing and offer either if you can help them, or if you want to sell, we will buy it from you and we'll pay a nice figure for it. So she went there and spoke to the woman running it. It was also a women's health club, and she said, no, we're fine, it's no problem, thank you. And so she was a little bit indignant because she didn't know that we knew they were having problems. Anyway, several months later, she came back. This is the lady who owns that other health club. She came back to my wife, and she said, and she was heavily pregnant then, and she was crying. She was really distressed, and she said, oh, look, my business is struggling. I can't pay my bills. The landlord has locked me out because I can't pay the rent. Now all my customers can't get in and they can't go to the gym and so on. So, please buy me out and you can have it for this much money. So we offered them this much, and now she's saying you can have it for this much. So Merlin was down there, my wife, and she phoned me and she said, so look, this is what's happened. What are we going to do? And I said to her, well, you can't buy it for this much. If we don't look after her, okay, if we don't look after her and all her people, then what are we? Why are we teaching this stuff if we can't actually put it into practice? And if we actually just give her a little bit of money, she's going to end up on the welfare system. And who pays for the welfare system? It's us. So it doesn't work. So I said to her, why don't you go back to her and offer her the same price for her club? Now, we don't want her club because ours is a big 5-star one. Hers is kind of a rubbishy thing, but we want her customers, okay? We want her customers to come and join our club. So I said to Merlin, why don't you offer her the same price? And then you tell her that we will also pay the rent and we will pay her creditors so that we get everything squared away. And then we want you, the vendor, to tell all of your customers that they must come to us. okay? And every time one of your customers joins us, we'll pay you a percentage, okay? This is over and above the purchase price. So we'll pay you a percentage. And then every time 10 of them join, we'll pay you a higher percentage for the next 10 and the next 10 and the next 10. And so we're offering her a lot of money to do a big job that we will all benefit from. So she went away, she agreed, and she went away. And of course, when we paid the rent and everything, they could open the doors and all the girls came back. And she said, I'm selling this club and we want you all to go over to join the big Fernwood Club. And if you do, you can join Fernwood for the balance of your membership in my club. They will let you finish that in their club. Okay, so you're going there for free. You've already paid me, but you're going to go there and go to a 5-star club. Now, we know that our sales team is going to retain them and offer them big deals to stay with us and so on. So you know what? They came in their droves. Woman after woman after woman kept coming. So many came that we didn't even know, we couldn't keep up with how many are coming from this lady and how many is coming from our own sales team. So our club just prospered and flourished and got really big. And this lady, she went away and she had her baby. There was no distress. Everything was paid up. And even years later, she was still always phoning people and say, you got to go and join Merlin's Health Club. You know, they love you, they look after you and so on. So it went on and on for years. Now, we paid quite a lot of money for that, but every year those girls renew their membership. So we doubled and doubled and doubled our money and our membership and so on. Because we cared, caring and sharing. We cared enough about the people, the human factor, in order to share the wealth and the expertise for universal prosperity. So we look at it and we say, we want to achieve universal prosperity and human flourishing. We want to turn human suffering and social distress into universal prosperity and human flourishing. And that is just one example of many, many of how we've done it over the years.
Wonderful. I think the more I think about this, I sort of think that one has to get this general spirit of how to do it and the love to the people, because then one can get these creative ideas like you have had in this case. Out of this caring, you have to, everyone for himself has to develop these creative ideas. I think there's no general implementation of this. I have a friend who is an engineer in a leading position who is very, very interested here in Germany. And he just asked me this question: how shall I do it in my position? I can try to generally create win-win situations for everybody, which I'm also already trying to do. But everywhere I talk about this here, they don't know this concepts in the way you teach it here in Germany, which is a problem. Worldwide, you are very, very well known and you have a massive impact, like, I don't know, nobody else I know personally. But here in Germany, it's kind of difficult for many people to get real steps, doable steps to implement this. And I try for this friend right now, maybe. What would you say to him? He's a leading engineer. He works for the state, good salary. But do you have general ideas? I don't think this is really the way for every one of us here. We all have to get the spirit, I believe, and to get creative ideas for ourselves to do it. But maybe you have one or two ideas for this friend on top of this, Dave.
Yeah, the thing is, Sasha, it applies to every circumstance in the marketplace. So, okay, obviously we're talking business, but it applies to family, it applies to social media, bullying, all kinds of things. So as long as there's caring and sharing, the whole change of culture becomes relevant. As an engineer, because I'm not an engineer, so I'm not in those positions, but let me put it this way so that people understand. Really, there are 6 major stakeholders in any business. So the engineer is one of the employees of a business, okay, whether it's government business or whether it's a private enterprise. So, you know, you've obviously got the owners, which are the shareholders, and then you've got the employees, and then you've got your customers, and then you've got your community, and then you've got your environment, and then you've got your supply chain. So those are your 6 traditional stakeholders in your company. Now, I'm just going to put this to you as a quick line, there is a seventh one, which we discovered back in the 1980s when I first became a Christian. There's a seventh stakeholder in your company, and that stakeholder is your opposition. Okay, so let's go back to those six. Now I'm going to take an example of Mars Corporation, the biggest private company in the world. You know, Mars, they make all the confectionery and lollies and sweets, Mars bars. So the idea is you must look after all of the stakeholders in your company, all six major stakeholders. And even that engineer, he or she would be thinking, how do I look after the stakeholders in this big company? You know, that the engineers usually have staff, they have people that they're working for them, working under them, and so on. But here's the point. Mars Corporation, such a big, clever company, very powerful, suddenly stopped growing. Okay, their profits started plummeting, and they didn't know why. And they started getting hold of their economists. They have in-house economists, many of them. And the chief economist was a Christian guy. And so they called him and said, hey, what's going on? So he took up, had a good look, and he found out that Mars was not looking after the supply chain. Okay, where does the cocoa come from for all of a lot of their chocolates and stuff? Well, it had dried up. So he got on a plane. Most of the cocoa was coming from East Africa. So he got on the plane, went over there to go and see what's happening. And Mars had dropped the prices and pushed the prices down so much that the kids, the little boys and girls who were picking all the cocoa and the parents who were processing it, couldn't even function. They were hungry, they were starving, and they couldn't do work for Mars. And so they had to go and do other business and other work. And so Mars came there and found that they had plundered their own supply chain to such an extent. They were so greedy, they pushed the price down until these people were unproductive. So then they said, okay, so the guy that went there had a good look at it, and he came back and he said, you know what, you guys, when is enough profit enough? If you want to build this business up again, you got to fix this minimum factor. Like it's like a 10-liter bucket, but there's a hole at 3 liters, and the water's leaking out at 3 liters. It's never going to go above. Look after the people, and you'll get more chocolate. So they agreed, and they tried it, and they did it. And then Mars suddenly, with profits, went right up, and these people in East Africa were flourishing because now they're getting more money and more remuneration. Okay, so we can all do that at all levels in a business. You don't have to be the business owner. You can be the employee if you're in charge of your department, like an engineer might be, and you look after your people. Now, you might not have any influence on their wages, but you would have a big influence on the workplace environment. Okay, are you driving them so they hate coming to work, or are you working with their dreams? If you work with their dreams, they will prosper and they will love you, and their productivity will go through the roof. And we know that from trying it back in the 1980s with my own workforce in the motorcycle company. When I worked with their dreams, they wanted racing bikes, racing motorbikes. I worked with those, and I said, oh, okay, you guys, I will buy you one of these bikes from Italy. You guys make it go fast. We'll bring an A-grade rider. We'll take on the Japanese bikes. And, you know, we started winning. They became famous as motorcycle mechanics, and they loved me and the productivity. And that's why we became a multi-million-dollar company.
Wonderful example. Thank you, Dave. I think much of it is, one could say, about the Christian spirit of love, so to say, but really doing it, not just talking about it in church or in conversation, but really thinking it through, how to apply it, even when it gets to the hard things like money, business, and the real down to the earth stuff of life. As an historian, I have insight that the big money of the world up to World War I was in the hands of businessmen in Europe and the United States, Christian businessmen. Because then it was kind of normal, a Christian businessman, he treats everybody fairly and right, he does honest prices, and when he gives his word, he will do it. This kind of was normal for Christian businessmen up to World War I. And they were the richest men in the world. They really had the big money of the world, Christian businessmen in Europe and America. And then kind of all this corruption before World War I set in, and it never went out again. And the Christian business world sort of was corrupted by the general corruption of the world from here on, which I believe you are taking a really good swing, or I don't know how to pronounce it, how to say it. You're really fighting this back, so that the Christians sort of get honest again, like the Bible tells them to be. I just sort of try to explain it from another angle, or to make it more like everybody can see what you are doing from topics, starting from topics which every Christian, and I think everybody should know how a Christian businessman ought to be. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And there's so many crooked Christians nowadays, Sasha. That was one of the big things when we started KI, was to try to get Christian business people to attract the favor of God. God won't put his favor on the Christians if they're crooks.
Yeah.
But if they're not crooks and they are helping others and so on, and they're looking after all the stakeholders, the community, which is others, even the environment these days, and so on, then the Lord says, that's what I've been waiting for. And he applies his favor, and we get into that area of supernatural multiplication.
Yeah.
That's what happened with me. That's what's happened with so many thousands of people that we've taught. So if we can, as you say, get the corruption away from the Christians, well, they will grow. But we also need the secular people and competing faiths, or everybody, to understand that the culture change that's required for their own benefit.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a Christian to be doing it, basically.
I think that is probably the most important point, that we all have to see and understand that it also benefits ourselves. I think there's a lot of Christian religious teaching out there where, especially here in Germany, I don't know how it is in Australia, but where people in Germany think when you get religious and sort of selfless, you're just destroying yourselves, and you're kind of helping everybody, and yourself get smaller and smaller and unimportant and helpless. And I think this is a point we all really must have strongly in our minds, that if we do this the right way, like God intends it to have, everybody profits, including the one who's who's doing it, and he or she maybe profits the most of all of this, like everybody can see in your life.
Yeah, definitely. That's 100% correct. So before we started doing this, we always had our limit of how much money we could make. And, if I'm as a business person plundering all of my people for profit, well, then I'm only going to make that much money. If I want wealth to become infinite, then I need to make sure everybody prospers on every transaction that I do. And then we all rise with the tide of prosperity, and wealth becomes infinite. Wealth can only come from human enterprise. There's no other way at all to make wealth in the world, to make money and so on. It has to come from human enterprise. So it's really important that we understand that if we create the environment for human enterprise and the humans are able to do it, then we all rise with the tide of prosperity. Here we are now. I'm just an ordinary guy, never went to university, never studied engineering or anything. I got thrown out of school when I was 16 years old. I got expelled. I never went back. I've never had any training. I was just a special forces guy in the military in the war in Africa. So none of that. But here we are with billions and billions of dollars worth of assets in the top 5,000 companies in this country, and having massive influence all over the world and so on, simply because I did business that way, caring and sharing. I did business God's way, the way the Bible taught me. And if we understand how it is, forget about religion and forget about the mindset of giving all your money away. That's not it. It's not a case of giving it all away. It's a case of let's multiply the resources and the assets so that we can all reach universal prosperity and human flourishing. And when you do that, crime drops, drug abuse drops, suicide drops, domestic violence drops, homelessness drops, everything drops and disappears because of everyone's universally prosperous and so on. And there's only one way to get there, and that is through holistic capitalism, caring and sharing in the marketplace. We've been trying it, the human race has been trying it for thousands and thousands of years and has got nowhere. We still have millions of homeless people everywhere, and starving people all over the world, and there's wars everywhere. It's easy to change that if we do it God's way.
This is a great teaching, Dave. I really love this, and we'll do our best to get this forward. I think I've thought about this. Probably you stress that you're having no in-depth education, so to say. I think there's a real awesome strength that you have had and still have. You were in the military and you were really doing special operations, one of the greatest in the world. And for many, many years, I think probably you're one of the most important military experts in the world still, although not doing anything active right now in there. But what I really think that you had one really great advantage. You had to learn that the stuff you learn has to be applied correctly, otherwise you're dead. And
Yeah.
there's a seriousness about it to do things right and to think them through. For 10 years, you had to be this way just to survive and to be successful. And I think there's a huge gap to most of the Christians who like go to church on Sunday and hear some lovely stories and then forget about it in the next minutes. This seriousness to get a concept and to apply it and to the very end, this is a really huge advantage you have had, and where you can teach Christians all over the world just to take the stories of Jesus and all the contents of the Bible and really to think it through. What does it mean for all of my life, for all of my business, and to even create great concepts out of this, including all details. I think in this thinking, you are one of the best in the world.
Yeah, I'm certainly not one of the world's leading military experts. I was in the Rhodesian SAS, which was the, one of the leading special forces units on Earth at the time, and there were only 40 of us there. But the point, though, is that when you're in the special forces, and yes, as you said, if we don't do it right, we get killed and we don't come back.
Yeah.
We always take on insuperable odds, with small patrols of 3 people taking on massive enemy contingents. But what I learned specifically is how to think strategically. And when you think strategically and you take the principles that are in the Bible, but you use them strategically, just like Jesus did. If we study Jesus as the man on the ground during first century Palestine, and we look what was he born into, and what was the socio-economic climate like when he was born, and therefore what influenced his decisions? What did he think strategically? How is he going to save the world? What's he going to do? And if you look at first century Palestine, you'll see it was so corrupt. It was so driven by greed and self-centeredness. The people were starving. The temple priests were so corrupt. They were plundering the people, taxing them off the planet so that they could take a big cut and then send the rest up to Rome. Rome used to go to the temple and say to the temple priests, you guys, if you want to keep your jobs and your opulent lifestyles, you must tax your people. And we want this, this, and this from the tax. So the temple priests went there and they put out tenders for regions so that the tax collectors would come and say, yes, I'll make sure that I get you 10 million. And I'll say, no, I'll get 15 mil. So they were bidding to have the tax region. Okay, once they got the tax region, they'd bid too high. So now they've got to plunder these people even more, their own people. So they plundered their people into abject poverty. They were starving. Over 90% were starving. The children were dying. They were selling the children. They were giving them away just because they would have more chance of survival if they went to a rich family. So that was what was going on. Jesus was born into that. Okay, he lived through that, grew up with everybody starving, crooked temple, Roman oppression, everything. And there was lots of rebellions. The Jews were rebelling to try and fight Rome. Small little armies were coming, and the Romans were savage, and they would destroy those armies and plunder and burn and so on. And when Jesus was 10 years old, he living obviously in a little town called Nazareth, as you know, that was quite close, about 4 or 5 kilometers away from Sepphoris, which was the regional city. And Jesus was a young boy there. He was 10. And there was a rebel by the name of Judas the Galilean. He rose up and he formed a little army to take on Rome. Okay, crazy. But he did, lots of them did. And he claimed to be the Messiah. Well, he snuck into Sepphoris one night when everybody was asleep, and he went to the Roman garrison with his troops, and he killed the Roman soldiers and took all the weapons, spears and everything. And of course, Rome reacted very violently. They came and they burnt Sepphoris to the ground, and they auctioned off all the women and children, trafficked them, and then they crucified 2,000 men in one day outside the city of Sepphoris, which was burning and in ruins. Jesus had to come and watch that, or everybody had to watch that. Everybody within 2 days walking distance had to come there and watch the crucifixions as a deterrent. So these are the things that Jesus saw, that he grew up with, and that is what influenced him to strategically set about destroying the corruption and so on. And he started by trying to win them to convert the priests and the Pharisees and all the crooked dudes. And he tried to get them, and they wouldn't change their ways. He said, repent, you guys, change your ways from this. You're plundering your own people. And they wouldn't, because they were making so much money, they had too much to lose, so they didn't do it. And that's why he systematically started shutting down the supply chain, the money supply chain to the temple, and therefore up to Rome. And that's why he got the tax collectors converted. He went after Levi, who became Matthew, who wrote a big chunk of the Gospel of Matthew, obviously. So point being, he got him converted, and with him came lots and lots of other tax collectors, because he was a regional guy who had a big franchise, and he was a customs agent making money everywhere. But he showed him a better way. So he joined Jesus, and that stopped a big flow of money to the temple. Then he gets Zacchaeus from Jericho region, and there were other cities that Zacchaeus was in charge of. It's not, you don't read it in the Bible, but when you learn the history, he was in charge of a lot of areas of tax. Well, he changed his ways and started putting money back into the system so that those people came out of poverty, were able to really grow, and Jericho became very prosperous because the Jews were now prosperous. Okay, so it went on, and that's why we think now strategically. We don't just go to church and we think, oh, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and Jesus says, love your enemies and this and that. Well, what did Jesus do on the ground? When you follow that thread, the people that he was healing for free. These are people, when they wanted healing, they had to go to the temple to get prayed for and healed through sacrificial from the priests. Well, the priests were charging them so much money they couldn't go, and the nation was sick. They were starving. Jesus is feeding thousands of them, 5,000. One time he fed 39,000 people, okay, 39,000, because they were coming to listen to him, looking for a solution for their starvation, okay? So he feeds them. And he feeds them for free, and he heals them for free, and says, go now and show the priests at the temple, and so on and so on. So when you understand all of that, that is where the strategic thinking comes from. We learned in the special forces, and I went looking for it in Jesus's mind. How did he fix the problems, the socioeconomic distress, and what is the model that we must follow based on that? And when you learn that, it's a whole different world. Christianity is not all about gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and religion on Sundays. It's very different.
Awesome. I think by having been a soldier for such a long time, and to see like the bottom of the brutality in the world, which you said earlier is more harnessed or covert in the free world, democracy, I think you really had this straightforward look into the Bible, which enabled you to see all this. I think it is very necessary you elaborate on this in your lesson 1 of your teachings, your KI teachings, the first century Palestine, it is called there. I think really we should get this around massively here, everywhere in Europe, because nobody really, or almost nobody really understands all of these concepts. From here on, and it is so logically, you just explain it, one just cannot say anything against it. It is just like it is, and but yet it is very different from what is the religious teaching you hear almost everywhere here in Germany.
Yeah, well, if you think of, we talk about sheep and goat nations, Matthew 25, it's called the final judgment. And we all, we learn that in the Bible. We go to church, we learn about sheep and goat nations. But if you think about it carefully, and I've only just skimmed the surface, of course, about first century Palestine, but if you know that Matthew was actually Levi, who was that tax collector in the, and the customs agent, and he was really, really plundering people, having outbidded everybody else. And when you're outbidding, it means you're going to plunder your people more than the next person that you're bidding against, right? So he then went on to write the Gospel of Matthew. So he is writing what Jesus said in the sheep and goat nations narrative. So this is coming from Matthew, who used to plunder those people. When he was converted, he now is able to write all about the sheep nations. And of course, the sheep nations is all about when Jesus comes back and he's going to divide the nations, sheep on the left, goats on the right, and the sheep on the right are going to go to everlasting life as planned from the beginning of time. The goats are going to go to hell, basically, and they're going to burn and all that kind of stuff. So what's the distinction between those two people groups? Okay, nations, ethnos is the Greek word used, but it's talking about people groups. And obviously, the times have changed since the first century Palestine in terms of interbreeding and ethnic groups like Australia, which is multicultural and so on. So it's typically broader than just, say, Jews or Muslims or somebody like that, okay? But the point is, it's based on your moral standards and actions. What did you do when you saw people starving, when people were thrown in jail illegally, when people had no clothes? What did you do? So that's the whole narrative. Did you just ignore it, or did you help them? So if you did something, then Jesus says, when you did this for the least of my people, you did it for me. Good, I want you on the right. But for you who did nothing, you're on the left. You're a goat. You're part of a goat nation. And the big deal here is, guys, keep in mind, this is Matthew, okay, writing this. He's saying those guys on the left, they actually weren't the perpetrators. Matthew was a perpetrator. He plundered people. He's saying you don't even have to plunder them. Just if you do nothing, you are a sheep nation. You're the same as the people who are the perpetrators. You don't have the option to do nothing. So again, this is all strategic stuff. So if you see this happening, it's, Lord, what is my assignment? How do I deal with this? You know, Dave said this and Sasha said that, but where do I fit in? What am I supposed to do? We all have different levels of assignments. They're all crucial. None of us are put on earth for nothing. We're all put on earth for a reason that God put us here. And there's some assignments might be knitting blankets for the mercy ships or something. Other ones are like me, have to create a whole big sheep nation. It's fine. They're all important and we all have to do them. If we don't do them, someone else has to do them and we end up over there. So we must think about our faith in a strategic fashion. And if we do, it's so much better for everybody in the community. We can achieve universal prosperity and we can achieve sheep nations, and we must. That's what we do.
This is really great, really great. What I also like about it, we as Christians, we would love to know every Christian how to do this, and we as Christians naturally want everybody to be a Christian. But besides, what I love about this, everybody who just wants a good civilization, wants a good country to live in, where he himself can prosper with his family, everybody, no matter what he thinks or believes, can see the logic in this, where you have massive proof of this concept. Everybody can get insight into this, and just to have a good and stabilized, healthy life for himself, can apply it, can see the logic in this, can say, yes, I want this, because it just helps all of us in the end. This is really a great other side of your teaching, I think.
Yeah, that's correct. The whole essence of it is that we must occupy culture. Okay, so when we say occupy culture, we're talking about occupying culture through unity and not adversity. So typically, when empires are formed, they occupy various countries and they occupy through oppression. All right, that's been throughout history. If we can occupy through unity, then you'll find that competing faiths and secular people, they come to you, they in order to get there, you must provide solutions for your adversaries, okay? So solutions doesn't mean shooting them. You've got to provide solutions. What are your problems? Oh, it's poverty. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. Okay, so we want to provide solutions for you, and therefore you will come about to our way of thinking because it works, okay? And once you are prosperous and flourishing, then they say, well, wow, where do these principles come from? I lecture at universities all over the world, secular unis as well as Christian ones. And I say to them, guys, I'm going to teach you stuff. It comes out of the Bible. These are Christian principles, but it doesn't matter the fact I don't care if you don't come to church. I mean, I want them to go to church, but the fact is they work. Otherwise, God wouldn't have given them to us. So let me teach you these. And very quickly, those who are used to oppose me and think I was some Fruit Loop crazy Christian and, you know, all that sort of stuff, a do-gooder and all the things, suddenly they're saying, wow, Dave, okay. And for 2 hours, they're asking questions. These are university students, and they're all asking questions. And at the end of it, they're saying, okay, so how do we apply it? And so on, because it physically works. And once we start to provide solutions for them, and this is what we do as KI, we use our businesses to provide these macroeconomic solutions, because our businesses are big enough to do that. So we do that like energy in the modern world. Everybody's building windmills and you know, photovoltaics, solar, and all that sort of stuff. But that's not going to clean up the environment, because when you look deeply into it, the footprint of carbon release when they manufacture that stuff never ever gets fixed for the lifetime of those solutions. They're not solutions. So it's our job to find solutions that work and must be profitable so that we save our economies. So let's clean up the environment, is what we said to ourselves. Let's get nice cheap energy and clean up the environment while we do it, and make the nation prosper. So how do we do that? Well, if we look after the stakeholder called the environment, and we cut our profit a little bit so that we can use some of the money to clean the place up and find new technologies to clean the place up, well, then you can produce electricity from coal, and it will be cheap and it will be clean. Okay, so we've done that. The Lord has given us technologies that we can do that. My point is that all of the environmentalists who would hate me because I have a big company, they would say, you're the problem because you create all the pollution. Yeah. Well, the Lord gave us solutions. Now they all love us, and they say, come and teach us, because we've provided solutions for them. So they come around to our way of thinking, and then we can occupy culture through unity because we've provided solutions. That's Jesus's strategic thinking. He did exactly the same thing.
Great. Well, Dave, we've officially run out of time, but definitely not out of things to say. Dave, thank you so much for being this amazing guest, a truly valuable man of God, and a friend who's more than trustworthy. You're rock solid, reliable. My wife and I really appreciate everything you do, truly and completely. God bless you, and until we talk again. Huge thanks to everyone watching.
God bless.
Thank you.